Hello, and welcome to Navigating the Format Review Process. This is intended to help explain the steps for that final step of your time here at the NDSU Graduate School, and that is going to be format review of your dissertation, thesis, or master's paper. And our agenda for this video is first to cover the prerequisites and the submission process, and then we want to look at what the graduate school is going to look for during format review. My goals today are to increase understanding of the review process and prerequisites, increase awareness of your resources, increase the basic knowledge of the format guidelines, and to give you an understanding that the review process is cooperative. So what is the graduate school's format review? First, it's a final step following your defense, following the final exam, before the degree is approved. It's preparation for publication, and that's to ProQuest and the institutional repository. That's where your dissertation and your thesis will go. And if you're having a master's paper, if you're finishing a master's paper, it'll go to the institutional repository. And that's we want to make sure that when we publish to those places, that we're following NDSU's format guidelines. The format review is a check for format only. There's not going to be any proofreading or copy editing of the content of the written portion of your document. And so when you do submit for format review, you want to make sure your written content is finalized. You don't want to start the process, and definitely you don't want to get approved with document content that you're not happy with and that your committee's not happy with. And to begin, I want to cover the basics, which is where to find everything online and how to submit, and a couple other aspects that you can see in these bullet points here. So first, I'm going to leave this area, and we'll go to, what I'd like to do is walk you to where that original site is found. So you're basically going to start at the grad school and click on current students. And then right over here, you're going to go to papers, theses, and dissertations. And this covers generally everything you're going to need to know. And I'd like to start by showing you the format guidelines. Now, the format guidelines are basically an explanation of every aspect of your dissertation, thesis, or paper. And there's quite a bit of them. So if we open this up, you'll see that it's 48 pages. And this instruction manual here covers basically everything that you're going to need to know. And you can see it's a lot of different things: the font, the prefatory material, the main body, the appendices, everything that goes into a dissertation, thesis, or paper is covered here somewhere. I should also mention that there's section formatting down here. And essentially every aspect, what you saw, basically this is the guidelines in web form. So you can go to each individual section and find out what you need to know. And then another good resource is the templates. We have an instruction manual. I want to mention that. And then we have non-numbered headings, which is basically your headings don't have any 1.1, 1.1.1. None of that numbering is going to be on these. And this one here is the automatic numbering. So this will have heading numbering applied. And whichever one you're using, or whichever you intend to use for your outline, you'll want to select that at the beginning. And I do have I believe a non-numbered, but I'll just go ahead and open this up. And this is essentially a pre-formatted layout for you. Here is the title page, and this is exactly how we want it to appear. You're just going to replace this, this is the title, so you're going to replace that. You're going to get rid of the brackets and then choose which one that you are using. So you'll do that, then you'll remove the brackets and put your name. You're going to replace this with the actual degree that you're getting, Master of Science, Doctor of Philosophy, whichever is applicable for you, you're going to put that here. And As you go, you'll see that every page is just waiting for you to fill it out. There's room for your abstract here, acknowledgements, dedication, and all the way down. And the neat thing about the template is if you remove a section, for example, the dedication is an optional section per our guidelines. So if we remove that, you could just go ahead and right-click here. And if you choose Update Entire Table, it'll zap that out of there. So now your table of contents is updated. The manual that's the instruction manual that you can see on the website, it explains how all of that is put together. It's not just an automatic thing, and you do have to pay attention to a few things as you go. But once you get comfortable with it, the template can be very useful and very helpful. And even if you don't use a template, it's good to just see how things generally should be laid out. And if we can here, we'll come back to the template a little more at the end, just to give a little more of how you should use it. And again, that's basically the format guidelines, and it's a really, really great first place to go. Now, if we go back to our main page, you'll see there's a lot of other different information points, but the main one that I want to show you is the submission point, because you're going to need to know where to go to submit your document. And this is the page to do so. And if you're doing a paper, you're just going to actually just send it as a PDF via email to the NDSU Disquisition Processor inbox. If you're using a doctoral dissertation or master's thesis, that's going to be a little bit different. And this will take you to ProQuest. And ProQuest is the company that NDSU works with because they have a very extensive database of dissertations and theses. And it's a great tool to make sure that your document is out there and is accessible to other researchers. And they also provide the administrative tools to review your document. And so to get started with them, you'll go down here to create or continue with the submission. And it's very easy once you get started. They'll tell you what you need, and you're just going to follow the steps and answer any questions that they have. I do want to mention that ProQuest is going to offer a number of different items for sale. And just know that that's between you and ProQuest. They're going to want to sell you things like a bound copy or printed copies and a couple other different features. And you're under no obligation to choose any of those things. You don't need to. A lot of students get through the ProQuest process without paying anything to ProQuest. So just keep that in mind. If you would like any of those things that they're offering, you can take it, but otherwise, that's entirely up to you. So once the submission process is completed, there is one payment that is required, and that is the payment to the graduate school for disquisition processing. And that'll be, you can find that right here. And it's $175, and that is the only payment NDSU is going to need for the review process. So going back to the PowerPoint, I do want to mention, after you've submitted, you should receive a notification directly from the disquisition processor, directly from that graduate school representative saying your document's been received and it's in our queue for review. And if you don't get that email, it means that something went wrong. So that's maybe a good time to email the disquisition processor and ask that question. You just want to make sure that, maybe something went wrong in the process and maybe it didn't go through. It's very rare that that does happen, but if you don't get that email, it's time to, you want to make sure that you are checking in on that. Once the document is received, you can expect about 5 to 7 business days for the review to be completed and sent back to you. And a lot of that depends on the time in the semester. If it gets very busy, if you're submitting right at the submission deadline, then you're going to expect, you'll have to expect that it's going to take a little bit longer. If you submit your document earlier in the semester, it's going to take less time to get that first review back. And I should mention also that the review process is iterative. So once you get the first review, you're going to get a list of changes and things that you're going to want to make to your document. and you're going to have to make those before the document will be approved. And once you've made those changes, you'll submit the document again. And the ideal thing, what we'd like to do is get 3 reviews where you get maybe one memo with a large number of changes. Then you get another memo with maybe just a few tweaks, a few final changes to make. And then the last time we review it, we're going to send you a memo saying, congratulations, you're approved. Now, if you go longer than 3, if you go to 4 or 5, there's no worries. It's just sometimes those things happen, and there's no reason to be concerned. If you go over 5, you may just want to reach out and say, I'm not understanding this part of it, or maybe see if you can contact the reviewer and see what's going on, or see what you're not understanding at that point. And but again, if you follow the guidelines, students who follow the guidelines and make sure they take advantage of those resources that are available, they generally do. They get to 3 is usually the number that happens. Now, the prerequisites these are things that are going to have to be submitted after your final exam, or you're going to have to make sure they happen before we can begin. And first is continuous enrollment. And that means you're going to have at least 1 credit in the fall or spring semester in order for us to continue with the process. Now, for summer semester, the rules are a little bit different. If you're defending in the summer, you're going to have to enroll for summer. However, if you defend in the spring, anytime before the end of the spring semester, and then you roll that review into the summer, then you can use your spring enrollment in that situation. So again, I want to repeat that. If your final exam is in the spring, you can roll into summer and complete the review process without having to enroll for summer. But if you're defending in the summer, then you're going to need to enroll for 1 credit. I did mention the payment earlier, and so that payment is also going to be something that will halt your review process if you don't have it happen, if it doesn't happen. So you're going to have to make the payment, and then we can move forward. You're going to want to make sure your report of final exam is submitted. That's very important. If you haven't defended, you should not be submitting for format review. And if that situation occurs, we're just going to withdraw that submission. So you have to make sure your final exam happens and the forms get submitted. You do want to make sure your research compliance paperwork is turned in, and that'll be for the IRB, the IACUC, IBC. There is a form that's the research compliance form, and even if you check no to all the boxes on that form, you still have to make sure that that one is submitted. If you check yes to any of the boxes on that form, that's where you're going to have to submit the additional paperwork. For example, the IRB approval letter. And the final thing is the disquisition approval form. And that approval page is different from the final exam. So make sure you're not getting those confused. And what the approval page says is you've defended and the content of your disquisition is approved by your committee members. So again, just make sure you remember those are separate things. And a lot of people get confused by that. So, just make sure that you're on top of that. Now, I mentioned the non-prerequisites. The first thing is those payments to ProQuest. Any payments to ProQuest, NDSU has no interest in. And so just keep that in mind if you are going to be engaging with them for anything. And then the bound copies, that's one of the things that they offer. I just want to make sure you understand bound copies are not required at all by the NDSU graduate school. And we would encourage you not to submit anything resembling a bound copy to us. Everything is going to be done through the PDF. And I should mention, your department or your advisor or your committee or all those people, they might ask you for a bound copy. And that's between you and them. The graduate school is never going to be asking you for a bound copy. Now, if you're feeling unsure after this video, again, make sure you review those format guidelines. That's a good place to go to start and make sure you understand everything and what's going to be needed. Review that entire dissertation and thesis page. That contains a lot of extra information that's beyond the scope of what we're covering here today. And the other thing I should mention is that you should also make use of the ones that are already published, the master's papers, the theses, and the dissertations that are already there. They can give you an excellent idea of what the document should look like. And to that purpose, I'm going to go ahead and just show you how I get there. All you have to do is just go to NDSU Institutional Repository. And there it is. And here it is. And if you go to this repository page, NDSU Theses and Dissertations is right here. You can find them by your program, your department. And then there's also a list down here of the recent submissions that have been happening. And so I recommend looking at these even during the writing process, even if you're just beginning your time at the graduate school, just so you can kind of get an idea of what a thesis here looks like, what a dissertation looks like, and what's being approved. So again, make use of that. It's a really good resource there as well. The next thing I want to turn to is what I'm going to be looking for in a review. And a lot of this is going to be covering some of the big things that we see that are errors that people make or things that people don't quite understand. So we want to make sure that those base level things are clarified. The next best thing to do after this video is to read through the guidelines, double check, make sure you get an understanding of how they look. Look at those documents in the institutional repository, see how it all comes together. So why is formatting so important? You might be wondering at the end of your time here, after you've done all that work, why is there this other step? And the important thing to remember is that we want to make sure that that work you've done is in the best possible appearance that we can make it. And that demonstrates that you care about the reader, that those other researchers out there who might be accessing your work, that you care enough about them to make sure that they can find what they need in your work. It reflects well on you and on NDSU. And we are in a new age of digital publishing. In the old days, it was understandable that you might expect that you could publish a bound in the old bound copy days. You publish your thesis or dissertation. What it does is it goes to the library, and then it sits on a shelf. And it's pretty rare that somebody might come and find it. That's not true anymore. In our new age, our documents are actually pretty popular. They're read by researchers around the world, and they're easily found. You can Google search them through the institutional repository, and then you can find them through the Network Digital Library of Theses and Dissertations. They have a global search portal that we're linked to, and ProQuest is available at universities all over the place, and think tanks and research, wherever research happens. You can find these ProQuest documents, and your documents are going to be there. So we want to make sure they're looking as good as they can. Now, when we're doing reviews, the three major concepts are the first two tie together. That's simplicity and consistency. Simplicity means that the written content of your document, your research, your data, what you're doing with it, that's going to be complex. The packaging that it goes into, we want to make sure that it's as straightforward as we can make it. We don't want to make things even, we don't want to confuse anybody with just the formatting. We want to make sure that that gets people right into where your work is. And that's tied with consistency. You want to make sure that if you set up your tables and figures to look a certain way on pages 1 and 2, that they look the same way, they have the same general appearance on pages 55 and page 80. And you just want to make sure that they're the same all the way through. You want to use consistent font. You want to use if your outline is set up a certain way in chapter 1, you want to make sure that you follow through and do the same things in chapters 2, 3, and 4 with how those headings appear. And the last thing I want to mention is that communication piece. The review process is all about communication. We're going to be putting together a memo, and we're going to be doing our best to make it clear what needs to happen in your document. And if you get one of those comments and we haven't quite done so, and you don't quite understand what needs to happen, that's a really good time to reach out to the reviewer and ask, what's going on here, or I don't quite understand. The surest way to extend your review process and to make it go longer is to ignore bullets, because then the reviewer is going to say, why didn't the person make the changes that I've asked for? And they're going to just ask for them again. So try to head that off. If you have any confusion about something, that's when it's a good time to reach out. So the first thing that we're going to be looking for in a document when we do our review is the order of elements. And the guidelines are going to lay out, and it's fairly explicit and pretty rigid. We're not going to change these. So this is the order that things have to go. Now, the title page is always going to be first. The approval page will be second. The abstract is required, and that's always going to be the third part of your document. If you have these optional sections, they're always going to be in that order. If you have tables, your list of tables is going to go right after your table of contents. If you have figures, your list of figures is going to follow the list of tables. And you can see it goes all the way down. The prefatory material is a major source of where students might not quite get it just right the first time, because you can see there's so many parts there in that just that opening part. The chapters go here, and then the references, just a note, they're always going to appear if you put your references at the end of the document in one combined references section. They're always going to appear at the end after the chapters, but before the appendices. Now, for references, you are allowed to place a references subsection at the end of each chapter. And if that's what you do, you're just going to want to make sure that that references subsection is always at the end of every chapter that contains references. So after we've got the order of elements laid out, we make sure that you've got things in the right order. We're going to look at that title page. And this is a big source of places where students might make us, might slip up here or there. I do want to mention the correct university name, and I'll show that on the next page or the next slide. We're going to use consistent bolding, or we're not going to have any bold at all. We'll just use standard text. And this is standard text. So if you want to make your title bold, then you have to make the rest of it bold. We want to make it consistent all the way through the title page. And just know that right here, I'm going to zoom in. We are the North Dakota State University of Agriculture and Applied Science. And that's the name that's on the seal of the university. This is the official name. And we get a lot of submissions where students will change that because they think this is where you're going to put the name of your program or the name of your college. But make sure you don't do that. And I should mention, starting here, one of the themes you might notice is that you want to keep it simple. A lot of students will make extra effort to change things in, for example, the template, and then we're just going to see it and tell you to change it back to what it was at the start. So don't change things in the template if you're using one unless you're sure that that's something that should be changed. And the rest of the title page looks just like this. We're just going to have first, middle, last, the name of your degree, your program goes here. If you have a transcriptable degree option, and you'll know if you do, if you have one of those transcriptable options, then you can include that there. Remove it if you don't, and don't just throw an option in there that you've made up. Down here, I put May 2035 because that's when I expect to get my PhD taken care of. But yours is going to be something a little bit different. If you're graduating in, for example, 2024, and your final exam is in March of 2024, then you're going to put March 2024. So the month and year of the final exam. Final thing I should mention is we always just want to put Fargo, North Dakota down here. Every now and then somebody changes that, so we'll just make you change it back. So that's how the title page should generally look. And I did mention those bullets, so I'm just double checking that. And if you can make it look generally like this, and note the double spacing, single spacing, we're going to look at that as well, then you're going to be in good shape. Now, the approval page is the next thing. And the most important thing to remember is that this is not your original approval page. This is just going to be a typed representation of that original. And the original is going to be DocuSigned and go to the graduate school. The approval page that's in your document is just going to be typed. And so when you are including it, just make sure it's in the same font as the rest of your document. If you're using title or Times New Roman on the title page, and in the rest of the document, you're going to want to use Times New Roman on the approval page. You're going to include the advisor, committee members, your department or program chair, and the date that the original approval page was signed. And you'll have that once the DocuSign process is completed. And just remember, there's no page number on the approval page or the title page. And final thing is, please don't put your student identification number on the approval page in the thesis or the dissertation or paper. We don't want to publish that. So this is what that approval page will look. You'll just, again, you'll type in the names of your advisors. So it won't say name of my committee member. It'll say whoever your committee members are. This will be the approval date. Again, same as what's on the copy 1 or the original version that goes through DocuSign. And then down here is your department or your program chair if you are, for example, interdisciplinary, because then you're always going to be a program. Now, as you continue to go through, the prefatory material is the next thing that we're going to be looking at when we review it. I should mention that the abstract has a maximum word requirement. If you're doing a master's thesis or a master's paper, it's 150 words. If you're doing a dissertation, it's 350 words. So that's going to be the maximum. And we are strict on that. We don't allow it to go over. And the reason that we have a number is because we don't want students to write a 1,000-word abstract. We want to keep it at a limit of, we have to set a limit somewhere, and this is what was decided. Now, your paragraphs in the prefatory material should be just like all the other body paragraphs. They should have a first line indent, they should be double spaced, and everything else. And that's just, we want to make sure, because sometimes people like to change things up. Maybe their abstract paragraph is going to look different in some other form of writing that you're doing. In the NDSU dissertation or thesis, they're just going to be the same as everything else. The only exception is the dedication. And the dedication is going to be center aligned. So you saw that earlier when you opened up the template. Everything else was body paragraphs. The dedication is centered text. So just keep that in mind. And the final thing I should remind you is the page numbering in the prefatory material is going to be lowercase Roman numerals. And a good rule of thumb to remember is the abstract, even though the title page and approval page don't have page numbers, they're counted. And the abstract is always going to begin on lowercase Roman numeral page 3. Another thing that we're looking at is the table of contents. It's a very common place to make an error because you, number one, have to follow the format guidelines, but number two, you do have to be accurate. We're going to check each entry, and we're going to make sure that it's pointing to the right page number, and we're going to make sure that it's identical to the heading that's out in the main document. And so with that in mind, make sure you review the table of contents guidelines thoroughly and focus on simplicity. So with that in mind, I want to show you the table of contents, and this is right out of our template. Our table of contents includes level 1, which is your major headings, level 2, which is the first level subheadings, and level 3, which is the second level subheadings. And that works for a lot of people. But I should mention, in the name of simplicity, the only level that the guidelines are going to ask for, or that they're going to require, is level 1. These levels are optional, and sometimes they're recommended that you include them, but you don't have to, per the NDSU graduate school guidelines. And we really want to make sure that, let's say you have a 6 or 7 level outline where it just, you've got first level subheadings, second level, and you got subsections of that and subsections and so forth. You don't have to include every single level. That'll cause problems sometimes because it's just more places where something might go wrong. So you generally want to keep things here concise and give the reader enough information to find the general subsections that they might need, and don't go too far into that. I showed you how you can automatically update the table of contents earlier. That's a really good skill to learn because it makes things a lot easier. It's a lot faster to do it that way than to go through the document and find the heading and try to write it down accurately and get the page number and then go back and build a table of contents by typing it up. Once you get the automated, once you get comfortable doing that, you'll never go back. It's just always the way that you're going to do it. Before you submit, I recommend also just either print the table of contents or just extract it if you're using a PDF reader that allows you to do that. Print the table of contents and maybe print the list of tables and list of figures and whatever else that you have, and just make sure, check through, make sure things are accurate. And again, pay attention to that line spacing. And as you can see here, individual entries are single spaced, but there's one consistent line of space between each entry. And no more, no less. We really want to try for that single line of space. So if you can make it look like this, you're in very good shape. Now, the list of tables and figures, that's another place where we're going to find, we find a lot of problems, a lot of errors because of the same things that I mentioned for the table of contents. So first things first, you're going to be including some column headings. And those are in the template, but they are visible here. So it's going to say table, page. Same thing with figure, page. Going back, entries are going to match 100% with the table and figure titles. And you have the option to include the entire entry. I should mention that the exception that I'm talking about here, the big one, is if you do have, for example, a super long figure title, but the actual title ends here and the rest is notes, we will allow you to remove the notes portion. Just do that consistently if you do it. So make sure all the entries do that. And that's just an option that you have. But this part does have to be accurate and identical to what's out there as your titles. You don't want to do any sort of paraphrasing or anything like that. And then the final thing I should mention is there's no table prefix or no figure prefix in the entries. You'll notice it's just the number 1. It'll be 2, 3. There's going to be no table 1, table 2, table 3. And so you're just going to have to make sure that if you do automatically update these, that you double check that and remove any prefixes that might come in when you update these if you use the template. So as we go forward from, we're just going to check the whole document, but part of it is as we're looking at the table of contents, as we're checking the list of tables, list of figures, and any other lists, we're going to be paying attention and looking out for your page margins, your page numbers, and your font. And so make sure you don't let anything exceed the 1-inch page margins. Make sure that the page numbers are not out of place, that they're not in an inconsistent font. And that's something to really look at because Word would like to put them in a different font from what you're using in the main document. And we don't want to include the wrong style. In fact, the page numbers are going to be very, very plain. They're just going to be center aligned in the footer. And there's not going to be any sort of page prefix. There's not going to be any sort of extra flourishes. It's going to be a very plain number. And if you do anything more, it's just like the other things I mentioned earlier. It's just doing extra effort to have to turn it back later once we see it. And again, with the page numbers font, we're going to be checking the font in the rest of the document as well. And I should mention the font size in some places can be a little different. For example, major headings, our guidelines allow them to be up to 4 points larger. However, the general idea for most other content is they should be in the same font size, with a few exceptions. And the font type should be the same throughout all components. So if you choose Times New Roman, it should be Times New Roman front to back. If you choose Arial or another one of the fonts that our guidelines gives, you're going to want to make sure that it's the same all the way through. And a good place to see that in action is if I go back, I'm going to quickly open up a template here. And this is Times New Roman. And you'll notice a couple places where the size can be a little bit larger. But otherwise, you generally want to keep it in 12. Again, it's smaller in a few other places, but generally 12 is the baseline here for Times New Roman. Now, if we go in and just a word to the wise, if you ever want to change the font in the template, you just go and modify the normal style, and that'll change everything. And so let's say we want to do Arial. Then it'll change it to Arial, and then you want to make sure you're using Arial throughout the whole document. In our guidelines, Arial is actually specified that you should put it at size 10 for your baseline. And so that'll be what it looks like. But again, you'll notice that even if we change the font and we use something else that we prefer, which is, again, you choose one from the guidelines. You don't want to go outside what's listed there. But if you do that, just note that you can, you're going to want to keep certain things that same, a little bit different font size. And as you go through, consistency, 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 except in those certain exceptions. And going back to the rest of it, that's a lot of what we're going to be looking for. Now, I did mention your headings earlier, just a few rules for them. Major headings are always going to be in all caps, and they're always going to start at the top of a new page. Subsection headings are never going to use all caps, and they're always just going to be in standard capitalization, and they're always going to just flow with the text and follow the text before it. And you're going to want to make sure you use consistent formatting through each chapter, as I mentioned earlier. I mentioned numbered subheadings. They're great in a lot of instances, but just keep in mind they add complication. For example, if you have subheading 1, 1.1, and then level 3 is 1.1.1, just imagine if you have 7 levels in your outline. That's going to just be a little bit more complication. So you're going to want to weigh that. Some programs, they will require it. There are some places where you're going to be writing, that's going to be the expectation, is they're numbered. But you just want to make sure you weigh the pros and cons before you decide whether you're using numbered or non-numbered. And I should mention, if you do use numbered subheadings, every subheading must be numbered, even those 7th level subheadings. They all have to have the numbering, and you just got to make sure it's correct all the way through. And again, as I mentioned, you're going to review your headings using that table of contents. And this is non-numbered. And just notice, here's our hierarchy. We have the major heading up here, all caps. Our subheading is here. And it can be centered because it's not in all caps, so we can distinguish between them. But you have, for every level, we're going to have to make it distinct from before. And now this is what's in the template, but you're allowed to change this if you want. You could shift this over to the left, but then you're just going to have to make sure your second level has something to distinguish it from the first. So that's basically how non-numbered headings work. Now, numbered headings, here you see where the formatting is distinct. But I mentioned before, you're going to have to make sure every heading is numbered. So just keep that in mind. And as you go, one of the things that is nice is that you could shift this over if you wanted. And because the numbering changes and we can distinguish based on that, then you don't have to worry about changing the formatting for each level. You could set them all to be just bold and left aligned or whatever you'd like. So just those are some things to consider for your headings. Final thing I should mention is that within a single level, so for instance, we have level 3, 1.1.1, we're using title case, which means that every word is capitalized except for articles or conjunctions, or words that are typically not capitalized in title case. Down here, third level, or this is the 4th level of your outline, 3rd level subsection, that's going to be sentence case. So just make sure that whatever case that you choose, you make sure that's consistent through every single level of your outline. And one of the nice tools that's out there is title case converter. And so if you have title case converter, that's really, it's pretty nice. So let's say I have something here, and I just want to make sure, I want to turn this set of text here into a heading. I want to make it title case. So I'm going to put it here, and then I'm going to select APA or Chicago or whichever one you would like to choose. And this gives you some consistency. Then you convert, and down here, you have title case. So notice little things, prepositions in APA style title case, if they're 4 letters or longer, as mentioned in this little block of text here, it's going to be capitalized. So there's a set of rules for whichever style manual you might elect to choose. And title case converter could really help make sure you're consistent. So then going back to the slideshow, just keep in mind, make sure you think about these things with your outline at the beginning as you're beginning to write, because it can be a little bit of a pain to untangle it if you've got a real mess and every chapter's got something different. So again, try to keep it going in one way as you go forward. Now, body paragraphs, it might be unusual to you that there's a slide to talk about them, a full slide, but it is something that I want to mention because it's really common to find body paragraph errors. And the first thing I should mention is you always want to make sure your body paragraphs are double spaced. You want to make sure the body paragraph always has a 1/2-inch first line indent. So that means wherever the paragraph begins, you're going to give it a 1/2-inch first line indent or a 1/2-inch indent there. You don't want to have any extra lines of space between each paragraph. So you don't want them to be really spread out across the page. You want to make sure that they just have a general one line of space between each paragraph. If you do have bulleted list items or numbered list items, that's generally double spaced. In fact, we were typically going to see that where you're going to be asked to make those double spaced. Block quotations, you can make those single spaced. Just make sure you're consistent with that. And with all those things, it's consistency, consistency, consistency all the way through. And one thing to help with that is Format Painter and in-paragraph formatting. And I'm going to demonstrate that really quickly. And that's just something that you can use in Microsoft Word. So what I'm going to do is open a new document. And I'm going to give myself some paragraphs. Just do 5 paragraphs here. And these are about as far from the body paragraph settings that the guidelines ask for as you can get. So it's a good place for us to begin. And now just imagine if this is actually part of a 80-page document full of headings and you got your tables in there and figures and everything going through. You can't just do Control A. You can't just select them all if you have all those other things going on. So the way that I recommend making sure things are consistent when you're working in a complicated document is to open up your paragraph settings first and just know that these paragraph settings are the foundation. Even before we get to any other word processing concepts, you can do generally everything that you need to do for the dissertation or thesis within this paragraph dialog box. So for starters, I want a first line indent. And then my line spacing, I know that needs to be double spaced. So I'm going to start there. And now I've got a paragraph that's getting a lot closer. This is what our guidelines are asking for. Now, this little paintbrush here is the Format Painter, and it's what I use a lot. And so basically what you do is you'll click on it, making sure your cursor is in the paragraph that's good, and then you can actually paste that formatting into the next paragraph. You'll notice if I just do one click, it gives me one instance of it. But now that I've got it in a new good paragraph, if I double click, then you'll see the paintbrush stays. And you can go through all the way through your document and just click all the way through and make sure that your paragraph formatting is consistent. Now, I did mention the extra line spacing between body paragraphs. So that's what this is right here. And we definitely want to get rid of that. So what you do is you go into your settings, and big thing that people miss is that if you have double line spacing, you're always going to want to do 0 points after. And that's a good rule for your dissertation or your thesis or paper, but it's also a good rule for general writing. You don't want to have a lot of extra spacing. That's just a waste. So we're going to go ahead and hit OK. And then we click there, and now we've got the spacing taken care of, except for the very first one. So we do the Format Painter, and we go up just like that. And that's how I do things. If I have a complicated document, I can't just do Control A. I have to do something else. It's a good way instead of, you don't want to go to this paragraph box each time all the way through. I should mention a couple other little things. If you use full justification, which means that it's going to be balanced on each side, that's allowed by our guidelines, but you want to make sure it's consistent. In addition to your Format Painter, another thing that's useful is the F4 function key. So if you click in this next one and you press F4, and most computers, and I'm generally speaking of a PC with Windows, In most instances, the function for key in Word is going to repeat the last thing that you did. So that's another really speedy way. If you do one change, you can make sure all the rest are the same way by just using the function for key. It doesn't work on every single machine. I've encountered some laptops where that trick doesn't work, or you have to actually go in and adjust the function key settings. But if you have in general, that function for key is a good one to rely on for some of those rapid changes. So that's basically the body paragraphs. And we just have a few more instances, or a few more sections to cover in this video. And then we can go and look at the template just a little bit more. So tables and figures, that's another one where there's going to be, we find a lot of things where we have to fix it, a lot of changes that we have to make. And to begin with, first things first, you want to follow the style guide appropriate to your discipline. That could be APA, it could be MLA, it could be IEEE, it could be a number of different styles. Some programs and some departments, depending on who you're working with or what field you're in, you might be using an entirely different style guide from somebody else in the same department. But you want to make sure that whatever it is, that it's appropriate, and most importantly, that you do it consistently all the way through. You want to mind your spacing and placement. A couple quick rules just to mention, but this is all in the guidelines. If you have a table or figure that's feasible, that it can feasibly fit onto one page, then you're going to want to make it fit on one page, and you can't break that one across 2 pages. And we're only going to break across 2 pages if it's absolutely necessary. That means that there's just too much of the table or the figure, and you have to break it across multiple. If you break across multiple, just know that there's guidelines about that. For example, the title of that item has to appear on each page that table or figure appears. Also, when you're working with tables and figures, you want to make sure, and in fact, working in the rest of your document, you want to make sure to cite your sources and avoid copyright infringement. And again, that goes for your entire document. It is your responsibility as a graduate student to make sure you're using copyrighted material appropriately. There's not going to be a copyright specialist at the end who's going to make those decisions for you. That's going to be your responsibility. And you want to take it seriously, because it can affect your career down the road if a copyright violation is found in something that you've written here at NDSU. So just keep that in mind. And there's a really great guide on our website. If you go to the copyright section under the general headings in that the table in the dissertations and theses section of our website. And I'm going to also put that guide in the same place where you found this video. That guide is, it's published by ProQuest, and it's a very, very good explanation of your rights and your responsibilities. And I always mention this for tables and figures because that's a really common place where copyright violations might occur. But again, you want to make sure you take that upon yourself to make sure you're doing things the right way, not only in tables and figures, but in the rest of the document. And again, if you do those things, and another thing I should mention for tables and figures, again, as much as you can, keep it simple, and you'll be okay. By keeping it simple, this is an APA 7th edition example table, and notice there's not a lot of extra borders. Notice that there's not any, we discourage the use of color or like shading rows and things like that. We generally try to keep things very simple. And again, because if you do include other elements, then you're going to have to, it makes it more challenging to be consistent all the way through. And if you look in the APA manual, this is how it's given. So if you're using APA, this is generally how you'd want to format it. APA figures look like this. And every style manual is going to have its quirks. Notice that for APA 7th edition, the figure title goes above the figure. In previous editions of APA, the figure title was below, and you're going to see it below the figure in a lot of other manuals. Now, Chicago, just little quirks to mention, it uses a single line. It doesn't break things into 2 lines. And again, we want to, generally most places are going to use this very straightforward 3 border table style, only using the borders that you absolutely need to make sure things are clear. If you use more borders at this point, it generally makes things more cluttered. So we encourage you to try to do it this way. And now this is a Chicago style figure. And if you notice, the title and notes and everything is all just on the same thing. And you don't want to make any, they're not breaking any breaks or anything like that. And so just notice that every place does it differently. You're going to want to make sure that you follow the whatever rules or whatever might be in place for what you're doing. And then you just make sure that you do it consistently all the way through, and you're going to be in very good shape. Now, references are going to be tied to tables and figures a little, because you're going to want to make sure, if you're doing APA style references, that you're doing APA tables and figures, unless you're writing in a field where your style manual might use APA references, but a different sort of thing for the tables and figures. And you'll know who you are if you're in that situation. And again, MLA, IEEE, and I should have put an extra E there, Chicago, whatever style manual you're using, you want to make sure the references all follow that same style manual. Just note that one style manual should be used. If you have a reference page and you're pulling from a bunch of different places to get those references put together, I would reassess that, because you're probably going to be pasting things in that are in different styles, and it's going to be things that we're going to ask you to change. That's one of the things. We take a generally fairly light touch, in my opinion, on references as a reviewer. But we're not going to be going through with a fine-tooth comb and checking each reference to make sure everything is exactly perfect. We're going to rely on you for a lot of those things. But if we see those things where there's style manuals all over the place, that you're going to get a note about that, and you're going to have to change it. Final thing is make sure that all information that's required is included in a reference. And we see a lot of references where it might just be the author name and maybe the title of the item, or maybe just a website. And generally, now in some instances that might be correct, but in general, that's going to raise our antennas, because that's generally not correct. If it's especially APA, Chicago, a lot of the bigger ones, you're going to have to put more than that. And one of the, if you use Google Scholar, that's one where if you find a dissertation or a thesis in Google Scholar, it's generally maybe only going to give you the author name or the author title when you press the cite button. That's not going to be enough. And you're going to have to go further, and maybe, especially for APA, they're going to ask you to list the university and a couple other things. So do your best with it. There's a point where we are going to say enough. We have to stop digging into references, but on a basic level, you do have to get these major things correct as much as possible. So now this is generally APA style. If you'll notice, one thing that tips us off to APA right away is the parenthetical. The year of publication, the date of publication is going to be in parentheses right after the author name. And so you want to make sure you include all that information. This is generally how a journal looks. Notice that the journal title's in italics. And then down here, this is going to be a book. And so the publisher goes here. But notice that if it's a larger work, the book title will be the one that's in italics. So it's little things like that to try to pay attention to as much as you can as you go. Chicago style does it a little bit different. And Chicago is more challenging because they have some quirks where, for example, this is in parentheses here, whereas in a book, it's going to be here and not in parentheses. So, we're doing our best to pay attention to those things. But as long as you can keep things in one style manual consistently throughout and follow those rules, you'll be in really good shape. Appendices, this is the last thing we're going to talk about for format. And basically, the first thing is review the guidelines thoroughly and know exactly how you want to include appendix tables and appendix figures before you start. If you're writing something, if it's just something that you're writing up, you're generally going to follow the same guidelines as the rest of the document. I see a lot of things like executive summaries, for example. And if you're just doing that as something that you've written, you're going to follow body paragraphs are going to be double spaced, first line indent 1/2 inch. Your headings are going to be the same format as the headings in the main document, and so forth. However, if you have documents that you've included in your research, like things that you want to maybe archive and you want to keep them looking the way they look, then you want to include them as images. Don't try to recreate them or kind of try to shoehorn them into our guidelines. Those you just want to include just as take a snapshot, or I know the LAIC in the Quentin Burdick building, they have a lot of really good resources like a scanner there, whatever you need to make it happen. Again, you want to avoid trying to make sure that, trying to fit the format guidelines to something that doesn't belong there. And I'm going to grab an example of how you can do this. And so it'll just be one moment here. I'm going to open up my folder here for the review. So I'm going to open up the first way to put appendices together. And you'll notice a couple little things. If it's a single appendix in your document, you don't include appendix A, B, C, D. You're just going to include appendix. And then this is just an appendix titled NDSU buildings, and it's going to give 3 separate appendix figures. And notice figure A1, Putnam Hall, figure A2, Quentin Burdick building, figure A3, Memorial Union. And that's how you'd include if you have, let's say you have a number of tables and figures and you want to put them all into one appendix. This is the way to do it. Now, again, I mentioned these are figures, but let's say you have a bunch of tables relating to your research that you want to put as appendices. It'll be the same concept, table A1, table B1, and so forth. If you have multiple appendices, appendix A, B, C, D, and tables and figures in each of them, then if it's, for instance, appendix C, then it's going to be C1, C2, C3 in that appendix. And that's how it'll be laid out. And if you do it this way, these will have to be included in a list of appendix figures and tables in a list of appendix tables that goes into your prefatory material. So now that's one way to do it. But let's say you have a bunch of, for example, a poster or something that's large and you don't know how to get it into, this sort of a format. The good news is you have another format. And now this rule is in our guidelines and you can find it there, but it's basically if you include a single item in one appendix. So again, one item, one appendix, then you don't have to follow the table and figure rules, and you don't have to put a list of tables or figures in for those items. So I'm using these same images, but imagine this is maybe some documents or some things that you need to represent that you use that you're trying to just archive, and you don't want to give them figure labels. In this instance, you'd go appendix A, and then the name of the item is going to go right here in your major heading. And then that'll go into your table of contents. And then you'll see, if we zoom back a little, one item, one appendix. The second item here, and there it is. And the third item, and there it is. And notice no titles. There's no real, we're not going to go after the guidelines here, except for you got to keep it in the margins. Everything else, once you do this one item, one appendix, you just put it in there as you need to put it in there. So again, this is very useful if you have, for instance, 4 or 5 things that you want to put in, and you can consider all of them one item. Now, let's say you have 25 tables. That might be it might be a better solution to put them in like this. So again, just know that you have options and you want to choose carefully as you're building these out, because it can really affect how much work goes into putting these appendices together. And again, we want to make sure it's simple. The presentation is as simple as we can make it and be useful to people. So then I mentioned, these rules here. I know one appendix, no appendix A. But again, if you can get those things going in the right direction, then you'll be in generally good shape. Now, I did mention earlier that we must take another look at the templates. And so if we go into our template again, notice, again, first thing I mentioned, if you want to change the font, best thing to do is change it right here in the style, modify it. I have put together a Word crash course, and you can find those videos, and they explain a lot of how these styles work. The instructions for the template also explain how some of these styles work. And the important thing to remember is every style that's applied, for example, this is GS1, then that's what's telling the table of contents to update and to follow that. This, it's going to look for that style applied to this paragraph here. And notice, as an example, this one has normal applied because we don't want it to be as part of our level 1, 2, 3, and 4 here. And so that's just something to remember. And if we go through, we look at the document here, I'm just going to change it back to Times New Roman. And so again, if we're back at the Times New Roman, then we're going to change this back to 10 and 12, or 12 points. So but if you have these styles, just know that, let's say I remove this first level subheading style here, and I go up to update my table of contents. Notice that it's not going to be included. And I should mention, it won't be included even if you style it up, or even if you go into the paragraph here. If you try to make this bold and centered to look like it, it's not going to come in there because it's still got your body paragraph style underneath. So to fix that, you're going to have to go right here and make sure that that's there. A couple other things, the table title style here. Table title is going to be what's tied to the list of tables. A figure title is what's tied to the list of figures. And as we go, we even have our appendix entries here. You're going to want to change this to whatever your appendix title is. And then you're going to have appendix table title, and up here, appendix figure title. So generally, everything that's tied back to our prefatory lists is going to have a certain style applied to it to allow it to update. So now if I go here and I update this field, I want to show you one thing that is a little bit of a drawback. Notice we've lost our formatting. And so then you're going to have to go in and fix it. And there's no real good way to avoid that with what we have here and with our templates. So that's just something that you're going to have to do. And within the videos that the instructional videos, I have given some shortcuts. So it's worth watching some of those formatting videos to get an idea of how to quickly make those updates to your list of tables and list of figures. So again, and then, for example, if you don't need a list of abbreviations or list of symbols, and you remove those items, coming back up here, it takes them out. And so you basically can automatically update. It keeps track of everything. Just got to remember that it's going to be looking for those styles, and you want to make sure that you apply them to the ones you need. And as a final thing I'll show you, you want to make sure that you don't apply them to things that you don't want included. So this paragraph here, I've accidentally put GS2 on there, but now, so the way that you might want to do this is to just get that formatting back, and there you go. Now it looks like a paragraph. The problem is that it still has the GS2 underlying. So if we come up here and you update right here, you choose update entire table, there it is. It's going to come into your table of contents. So we want to make sure that we're not doing that either. And so that's basically the template. And it's a place to get started. There's no obligation to use a template. It helps to be familiar with Word. And again, you're not required to use one, but it's really, really useful, and it's something that you should look into using. And again, even if you don't necessarily use a template, it's a good place to sort of observe and see what the right thing looks like. If the template does give you a ton of problems, or if it's something that it's not working, then I would abandon it. I would not use the template if you find that it causes issues. And finally, you can always seek help at the LAIC. They offer walk-in consultations, and that's in the Quinton Burdick building. They can get you started and get you kind of an understanding, or help kind of troubleshoot what might be going wrong if you're having a problem. So with that said, it's definitely something that's worth looking into as you move forward. So how to avoid issues? Number one, start thinking about the formatting early. Students have gotten into trouble in the past if they submit a document that's in really, really poorly formatted shape, and suddenly it becomes a real challenge to meet those final deadlines for graduation. You don't want to be in that place. Again, as I mentioned, review the guidelines and review the approved documents in the institutional repository. You want to make sure you get a sense of what the right thing looks like. Visit the LAIC for formatting assistance, and definitely take advantage of their thesis formatting in Word workshop. That goes deeper than my crash course videos and gives a real thorough overview of how formatting works in Microsoft Word. They're a really good resource for you guys as far as formatting is concerned. As for the writing part of it, definitely visit the Center for Writers. That's whether you feel that you're a strong writer or a writer who might need assistance. It doesn't matter. You should talk to the Center for Writers. They are an excellent resource. The graduate consultants there have done a lot of work to get to where they can provide you the assistance that you need, as well as to teach you, and you'll be learning things as you go. And then again, the other thing is always ask questions. If you're not sure how things should generally be, send an email to the Disquisition Processor. Talk to the people at the LAIC, see what opinions they have, and make sure you're doing that preparation ahead of time. It can be very challenging if you haven't done that preparation. You can find yourself suddenly, you're trying to graduate, but you have this mess on your hands, and you want to avoid that. And again, if you take some steps to prepare, you're going to end up in really good shape. And with that ends the video. And I do thank you for watching through it. And just make sure as you go forward, you take advantage of all those other resources that are available to you.